Our theme for the day, pulled from the line of that song we just heard, is Teach Me. The line in it is, Teach me some melodious sonnet. As we join Peter, this wandering heart, with his vacillating allegiances and his confusion about Jesus' identity and the goal, and his eagerness and his reluctance, we have this week a lesson from Jesus after Peter has asked a question. Jesus is talking about forgiveness and community and relationships and how to be together. And Peter asks, I want to say, sometimes we talk about people being on their phones during worship, and sometimes we know people are looking things up on their phone. And that's what I was just doing, Peter. I was curious about how many times the word church appears in the Gospels, and it is 2 times, and this is one of them. So that's interesting. It makes me wonder if it's a later addition a little bit, but it says tell it to the church, and it only appears one other time in the Gospels. There are other times that words that mean assembly appear, but that's the only time that that particular version appears. Anyway, Jesus is talking about forgiveness and community and relationships and how to be together. And Peter asks, how often should I forgive? 7 times? And Jesus gives him a hyperbolic answer. Not 7, but 70 times 7, or in some translations, 77 times 7. Well, I have questions. Here's one. On the one hand, this comes on the heels of what we talked about last week with Peter getting wrong what was supposed to happen in the trajectory of Jesus' life and being told harshly, get behind me, Satan. So for sure to him, to even speak up is a big deal. And he asks this question, and I wonder, who does Peter need to forgive? And also I wonder, is Peter wondering how often Jesus will forgive him? Maybe if it's 7 times, I'm still okay. But Jesus says, not 7, but 70 times 7. So Peter's forgiven, we know that for sure. Now he has to go about the hard work of forgiving whoever it is that he needs to forgive. Every person in this room has been harmed in one way or another by other human beings, some by others in this room. And everyone in this room has harmed other people in little and big ways, intentionally or not. So first, let's get clear on this. We are all in need of forgiveness. I know that's hard to hear sometimes in a room like this, for a couple of reasons at least. One is, the language of sin and forgiveness is really bound up in some difficult theology that has been hurtful to people, including perhaps some confusion about what sin is and what it isn't. For instance, naming someone's queerness as a sin, and then requiring some awful things to try to remove that sin, which does terrible, terrible harm. So I get that this language is really complicated. And so, of course, if I'm handed this text to preach on, I have to preach the complications, because we need to find a way through to what is good news in the Bible. So that's my hope for today. If this is you, if this has happened to you, go back to what I said before. We're talking about how human beings harm one another, and we've all done it. But in those situations, you were harmed. And the sin in it wasn't you. It was the people who were telling you that that was a sin. And actually that leads to another way that this stuff is hard in a room like this. Many of us have been harmed, abused in some way, in some really atrocious ways. And we see daily news, like about the Epstein files and now Cesar Chavez. And I know that injury has resurfaced because of that for many people. And sometimes those injuries are from people in the church. And so, for you to be given this advice to go to the person who harmed you in a time when the two of you are alone, please don't do that. Never do that. Please don't ever take that biblical advice. This advice is for people who have harmed one another on some kind of equal playing field, not the context of abuse where there is power at play. For you to take this biblical advice could potentially create greater harm for yourself, and we are not about that. At the very least, you skip to the next step, which would be to take someone with you so that every word might be confirmed by a witness. But you might not even want to do that. If somebody has harmed us, forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean forgetting that person might be harmful, especially if they're unrepentant, a predator or abusive in some way. Forgiveness can be dangerous if it leads us to re-engage in a relationship prematurely with someone who is likely to harm us again. Jesus does not ask that of you. But I stand by these words. We are all in need of forgiveness. What do I mean by this? And what exactly is forgiveness? There's probably a lot of different ways to describe it, but I'm going to tell you about one that I read about this week. And I hope it will help make all this a little bit more helpful. I read a super interesting interview this week from Sojourners magazine, an interview with womanist theologian and clinical psychologist Shaniqua Walker-Barnes, who's thought quite a bit about forgiveness. She defines forgiveness as an internal process that is directed outwardly. It's directed towards another person, and it is the process of letting go of the hostility that we have towards a person that we perceive as having wronged us. It is an important distinction. We usually think of forgiveness as an interpersonal act, something that happens in a relationship. And we think of it as a one-time, one-and-done thing. Like when you're a kid and your parents make you say you're sorry, and then the other kid has to say something like it's okay. A conversation that involves words that mean I forgive you in one form or another. And the adult version of this, we think forgiveness has to be contingent upon something the wrongdoer does. They have to repent, they have to reconcile, we have to restore the relationship, and they have to change. But Walker-Barnes says in this article, that keeps our emotional process held hostage to another person's issues. Forgiveness is a way of taking our power back and saying, I have my own feelings that need to be done. It allows us to take control of the process and then isn't contingent on anything else another person does or has capacity for. Shaniqua Walker-Barnes is saying something really different in her definition of forgiveness as an internal process of removing hostility towards another person. First, that it's internal, that it happens inside of you. It is directed outwardly to someone else, but it is internal. And it is a process, not a thing you decide one day and then say, then we're good. Forgiveness and its opposite, unforgiveness, is not something we just decide, but an ongoing process, partially connected to our biology, our neurochemistry, and our trauma history. I'm sure we've all had an experience before of working through something, worked through all those negative feelings, worked on the reframing or whatever, and even forgiving someone, and then suddenly something happens like we're seeing now, and it all comes back up in some way in our lives. The grief or trauma or some event comes back up. And then we have to go through all those stages again in one way or another, process those events again, and eventually we get around to needing to forgive again. Not for the other person, but because it is about the hostility that we have within ourselves directed towards that person or people or institution, and that hostility needs to leave our bodies for the healing process. So this was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because maybe Jesus is talking about someone harming you a nearly infinite number of times, and you need to forgive that many times. But I think it's also possible that you could forgive 70 times within your own heart for the same thing. because our minds keep going back and replaying all the old wounds, and it will always be necessary for the healing and wholeness for us to find some way through it, including shedding that hostility. Because in our response to being harmed or to trauma, we can get so angry and so stuck in a moment that we lash out at other people and perpetuate harm on another. So when I say we are all in need of forgiveness, at least part of what I mean is not that you need to be forgiven, but that we all need to be in the process of forgiving, because forgiving is also important for our own health and wholeness. I'm going to give an example. Back to our original problem that perhaps helps flip the script a little bit. Early on in my pastoral, actually when I was on internship, I met a man named Jesse. And his story and my experience with him has been such a gift to me. Jesse showed up one year during Lent. He was dating one of the women who sat in the widow's row, and he apparently liked her enough to come to church, though I would learn that it was a place he hadn't been for 40 years, and it was very hard for him to walk through those doors. Jesse grew up as a girl in North Dakota and was active in youth group and had a really good friend in youth group. But somehow the youth leaders sensed that there was a little more to their friendship, and actually there wasn't. And more than one time tried to pray the gay away for him. Obviously, Jesse left the church and lived as a lesbian for some 35 years before discovering his trans identity and transitioning to being a man. A man who had once knelt in a church as a girl, a church that looked a lot like the one I served, that he was standing in, where they had made him kneel while they all prayed over him. He wanted to go back in the sanctuary. And he found a similar place on that kneeling rail. And I sat with him and prayed while he sobbed all that pain all over again. And I prayed for him. I prayed that he would know his worth as a child of God. I prayed for the people who had harmed him, that they might come to know a more expansive God. I prayed that Jesse might find ways to forgive them for the ignorance that they had and how much harm it had caused him. I prayed that God would find a way to teach those harmful ones a better way to love. I prayed that Jesse could put that pain behind him and let it go. Those words, and maybe mostly his boldness to come into that space and kneel in that similar place and hear a different prayer, may have helped him begin another forgiving process. It was enough to make it a little easier for Jesse to let go of that hostility that held him captive. He didn't have to go back to that place and encounter those who had harmed him. But now he could reclaim the church as a place that was for him, where he belonged. In fact, a few months later, we baptized him and named him as a child of God. He was so happy, and repair is so vital. I am also sure that pain and anger probably came up again, and he probably had to forgive again, maybe 70 times, 7 times. And those people that he hadn't spoken to for 40 years will likely never know. Jesse's forgiveness process isn't dependent on them knowing. That's just Jesse's journey. Yours does not have to look like that. We don't even have a railing. And also, when it's possible for you to restore relationships, when it's not harmful to you, of course, that is the hope. That is what leads to peace, if you can work with another person in the healing and forgiving process. What leads to beloved community. When I have harmed someone and have felt their forgiveness and how they were able to let go of their hostility towards me, then I am more at peace too. And reconciliation brings healing to the whole community. I think that's what we all long for. We are all in need of forgiveness from every side. I think that's the lesson here. So blessings in the process, however many times it takes. All of us are on journeys towards health and wholeness. Amen.